Did you know that 55% of Americans live in the suburbs? That's over 175 million people who live away from the cities. Hi, welcome to Steve Talks. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the problem with the burbs. Suburbs get a bad rep, but is it deserved? Before we dive into that, let's take a look at some history. Suburbs supposedly started in ancient Rome. Rich merchants went out onto the hills, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, and they built their villas on the outskirts of town. Let's be honest, not much has changed. In the 1700s, the rural folk of America and Western Europe moved out of the country and into the cities. And this caused the middle class, the almost rich people, to move from the cities out into the outskirts. Again, the rich middle class escapes the city to live out in the suburbs. Do we see a theme with rich middle class moving out of the city into the outskirts? In the 1800s, the railroad made it possible for people to commute to work. This created the first suburban corridor outside the cities of New York and Boston. The automobile finished the job, leading even more to flee to the suburbs in the early 1900s, with a huge suburban boom after the World Wars in the 1940s and 50s. So what do the suburbs look like? The suburbs tend to be single-family, detached homes. City councils tend to limit mixed-use spaces, making it so that you can shop, work, and live in the same neighborhood. A staple of the American suburb is the shopping mall or the strip mall. You see box stores. You see windy roads that lead to nowhere. You see cul-de-sacs. You see parks, green space, golf courses, and many other amenities catering to the upper middle class people who tend to live in the suburbs. So before we jump into the negatives, let's take a look at the positives. There's a writer on breakthrough.org, or he used to work for breakthrough.org, which is a kind of a conservative-leaning think tank, if you will, by the name of Judge Glock. I have to say, kick-ass name, Judge Glock, but I digress. He claims that the suburbs are actually a good thing. He says that there's potential for green technology. There's so much detached space, so much light, so much everything that you can have smart thermoses, you can have solar tech, you can have well-insulated windows. There's a lot of potential to help save the climate through the suburbs. He claims that the parks and the walking trails and the green spaces lead to even more potential for carbon to be pulled from the atmosphere and oxygen to be released. He claims that also through these park systems, you're going to have healthier people because they're going to have the ability to exercise outdoors more often than not. You're going to see less traffic, which leads to less noise pollution, less carbon monoxide emissions, less carbon dioxide emissions, less particulate matter, and all the other downsides with traffic jams that we find. You're going to find less litter. Less people live in the suburbs, so you're going on the whole, find less litter in a suburban area. And with all of this combined, you're going to see less pollution. I actually agree with a lot of the stuff that he says, except I do not agree with the premise that suburbs will save our climate. So let's get into the environmental reality, if you will, of the problem with the suburbs. First off, every single lawn tends to have, at least here in Colorado, has Kentucky bluegrass as the lawn. You've got the same types of trees, you've got the same types of flowers, you've got the same types of everything. This monoculture of the suburbs actually limits the biodiversity of the area. And if you look at other areas around the world, you know that a wide variety of animals, plants, flora, fauna actually creates a healthier ecosystem. It makes it so that the ecosystem can thrive without humans having to influence it and push it and push it and push it. Another aspect is walkability. A well-developed, environmentally friendly community should be walkable. You should be able to walk to a bus stop, to a train stop, to a tram line. You should be able to walk to a store. You should be able to walk to and from your entertainment. You should be able to walk to and from your bar. The suburbs gives us a maze of roads with no direct routes, and with the limiting of mixed use zoning, nothing is close. Add all this up, and cars are no longer a luxury. They're a necessity if you live in the suburbs. Which brings us to public transportation. Depending on where you live, this is getting better, but it still sucks for most people in a suburban environment. As of now, only 11% of US adults utilize public transportation. And of the 11% that actually utilize public transportation, only 6% live in the suburbs. That's a problem. We know that mass transit can help save our environment. We know that limiting the amount of cars on the road can lower noise, that can lower emissions, can lower the rate of asthma in certain areas. We've seen in LA that just 20 cars switching to electric has lowered the amount of asthma-related hospital visits. We know that traffic and congestion creates issues. So what do you get when you have a necessity of cars and nobody using public transportation? You get traffic. We need better access to make the suburbs more sustainable and to limit the amount of traffic leaving the suburbs to get into city centers for work. And the last point that I'm going to bring up on this video is water pollution. People don't think about the water pollution that the suburbs produce. You have a bunch of green lawns. How do you get that manicured lawn? You have to use herbicides and pesticides. Herbicides create a growing imbalance in most plants that will kill a plant. People use them here in the United States to get rid of certain weeds that grow in the lawn that change the way the lawn looks. Pesticides are used to get rid of pests. All these chemicals that we're putting onto our lawns as we water them and we make sure that our lawn stays green. We hit it with the fertilizers, we hit it with the herbicides, we hit it with the pesticides, we're watering it. All that water picks up these chemicals and it either washes out of our lawn onto the street and down into our storm drains, or it seeps down into the water table. Either way, you're carrying a lot of chemicals down into the water table, which, I mean, in my opinion, is probably not the best thing. In addition to that, because of all these roads, these mazes of roads, you have a lot of potential for oils and emissions to settle down onto the road, to be washed off in storms down the storm drain. People, as much as I wish they didn't, throw stuff out of their car. As they're walking down the street, they throw things on the street. Or municipalities just don't have the resources to pick up every single trash bin. And so they blow out of the trash bin. You have birds that will come and take them. However it happens, litter is a thing. Where there's humans, there's litter. And unfortunately, when it rains, this litter gets washed away. Where it goes, usually watersheds, usually parks. And another thing that a lot of people don't realize is road salts. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, we have a lot of winter weather. The way to combat winter driving conditions here in the United States is to hit the roads with magnesium chloride or a road salt. Salts are actually toxic to a lot of plants and animals. So you lay these on the roads, it melts the snow, makes it safer for the cars to drive. And then as the snow melts and everything, it runs off into the gutters and then down into our ponds, our lakes, our rivers, and creates these toxic pools of sediment. So all of that, there's a huge amount of water pollution that comes from living in the suburbs. So how can we help? If we happen to live in the suburbs, how can we help? First, we can plant a garden. Instead of a perfectly manicured lawn, we could grow our own vegetables. We could eat fresh tomatoes instead of going to the grocery store and buying. We could limit our carbon impact of the transportation of the foods that we eat just by growing a little bit of a garden. It's not easy, but it really is worth it. Have you ever tasted a fresh tomato? Oh my goodness. So good. Another thing we can do, we can xeriscape our lawn. In many communities, especially ones that are hurting for water, the local government, state government, or federal government will give you subsidies to tear out your lawn and replace it with a water-conscious substrate. This is really cool and something that's definitely worth looking at. And the last one is also pricey, but in my opinion, might be one of the most important things that you can do if you live in the suburbs. And that is to install solar panels and make sure that they're hooked up to the grid. Not only does this help cut your electric bills and cut your footprint of the demand of the electricity that your own house uses, if at any point, if you connect it to the local grid, if at any point you're producing more than your house can store or use, you're actually feeding the grid so even more people can use the power that you're generating. It's a win-win. It's a renewable resource. And it also takes a lot of money away from big oil, which we'll cover in a different episode. Anyway, these are 3 things that we can do to make living in the suburbs a little bit better. I'm gonna add a little bonus. Pick up some trash. Do little things. Because if everybody does a little thing, we can enact big changes. We'll see you next time.